Donc bienvenue à ce séminaire sur la série Sécurité du logiciel. Donc l'exposé sera en anglais, donc je vais passer à l'anglais. So let me just switch to English and introduce our speaker today. So this is Bhargavan. He's Senior Research Scientist, Directeur de Recherche at INRIA in Paris. And before that he was working at Microsoft Research in Cambridge, I guess. And so he's both an expert in security, especially security of the web, let's say, cryptographic protocols and things that go on in the browser. Last week we mentioned his work with co-authors on defensive JavaScript. That was fun. But he's also an expert in program proof and deductive verification as one of the designers and implementers of the F-star system, programming language and verification system that we mentioned, I think, last year at the end of the lectures on program proof. And so today he's going to tell us about his work that mixes or combines these two strands of research. So thank you very much, Karthik.
Thank you for the introduction, Xavier. So today, I'll be going over some of the work we did in our team for more or less the last 10 years. It feels like a long time now. I'm currently at a mini sabbatical in India. It seems like a good time after these 10 years. The work I'll be describing is co-authored with many people at INRIA, as well as Microsoft Research, CMU in Stuttgart, some of whom are in the room. And I'm not going to be throwing in too many bibliographic references, but I'll have enough keywords in there that a simple Google search should turn up the papers. So hopefully that's good. Okay, so what do we mean by real-world cryptographic protocols? What is this real-world thing about? Isn't everything real-world? Well, what we usually mean is things on the web. Okay, so this morning I went to LCL, which is my bank, and it gives me this nice image. And of course, if I try to log in, it asks me for a identifiant and a code personnel. So at this point, I have to make a decision. Is it safe for me to put in my code personnel here or not? And what is the reason that I feel confident enough to do it? Well, there is this tiny little lock on top, which tells me that it's probably secure to do it. And what am I really looking for? I'm looking to see if there is a secure channel between this window, where I'm actually going to type the code, and LCL. And what does that mean? Well, what I'm looking for is a channel that goes through from this browser window that I'm typing in all the way to this web server belonging to LCL, under the knowledge that I do have other browser windows open, and some of them might be to somewhat naughty sites or whatever, which may have malicious JavaScript on them. And I'm connecting to a Wi-Fi network, which I don't control. And I'm going over a network which I don't control, all the way to some data center somewhere on the web, where there might be other websites also hosted by the same web data center, some of which may be malicious. Okay? So in this world, I still want to have a secure channel between this tab where I'm typing my code, all the way to this web server belonging to LCL. So this is what we call a secure channel. It's an authenticated confidential channel that I need, which provides security against a class of powerful attackers. We sometimes call them network attackers, but they're more than just a network. They can, of course, read all the data we have to assume between, which is being sent on the wire. They can tamper with these messages as well as they may be trying to impersonate LCL to me by providing some URL like lcll.fr. They might be impersonating me to LCL by knowing my identity code, but not necessarily my password, and so on. And the reason I think I have a secure channel here is because of that lock. And if you click on that lock and look inside Chrome, it will tell you at the bottom, this page is secure because it uses valid HTTPS. I don't know what valid means, but it uses HTTPS. And then if you click more, it says, it's actually using TLS 1.2, which is what LCL supports. It doesn't support the latest version, which is 1.3. And inside TLS 1.2, it is using this acronym soup, which is ECDHE RSA with P256 and AES 256 GCM. Okay, and those of you in the know will basically say, okay, what it's doing is there's a protocol called HTTPS, which inside it uses a protocol called TLS 1.2. TLS 1.2 itself relies on 3 security functionalities, one of which is ECDHE, one is signatures, one is authenticated encryption, and these functionalities are being implemented by these 3 sets of algorithms, which is the NIST P256 curve, the RSA PKCS 1v1.5 signature algorithm, and the ASGCM authenticated encryption algorithm. Okay? And so we have gone up from what we want, which is a secure channel, all the way down to what are the algorithms that have to be combined to achieve this. And if you actually look at what the protocol that is running inside TLS is, well, from 1994 when it was first called SSL to now when it's called TLS 1.3, the protocol is essentially the same structure. Okay? It's a classic two-stage structure. You start with a authenticated key exchange where the browser and the server are establishing a common key K, which is supposed to be shared secret known only to the browser and the server. And you want to authenticate the server. I want to make sure that I'm making this connection with LCL.fr and not with somebody else. Once I have this key K, now I go into stage 2, where I'm going to be sending a stream of data to the server, and the server may be sending a stream of data to me. I want both these streams of data to be protected under this key. And there are many, many variants of this. One variant is implemented in IPsec, another one is implemented in SSH, TLS implements a third variant. And all of these variants have proofs. So there are many long history of proofs. This structure, this construction on the right, which is just like 5 messages or 4 messages, has been known since the 1980s. Okay? It's like really old and really classic. So one might assume that this is solved. There should be no issues. This is so well known, so many proofs, this is done. Of course, like we've been seeing in many lectures already in this course, it is not. So this is just a selection. I can't fit them in one slide, but this is a selection of attacks from 2011 to 2016. There is another set of attacks before that and another set of attacks after that. This is about the time when we got interested in TLS, so that's why I'm putting this selection of attacks in there. So what goes wrong? I mean, the theoretical protocol is nice. It's 4 messages or something. Is really simple and it's well known. And the deployed TLS has bazillion attacks. Each of them has a keyword. It has a logo, so obviously it's important and so on. So what is it that is going wrong between the theory and the practice? So I would say there are 3 categories of things roughly that are going wrong. And I'm going to look at them both each in detail. Okay? The first one is crypto weaknesses in the crypto. The second one is the flaws in the design of the protocol. And the third one is flaws in the implementation. But we'll see that all of these flaws don't really appear if you look at the protocol in too simple a way. You have to kind of step back, gather more of the protocol, look at it in its wholeness, and then you start seeing these flaws and they start making an impact. Because often what you need in order to see an attack is a combination of these things. So let's look at what kind of crypto weaknesses have been affecting TLS. Okay? So here's the simplest sub-case of TLS. This is the first part, the authenticated key exchange. And let's just throw away everything, even the authentication. What's happening is a Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and those of you who have attended security courses know this is Crypto 101. A is sending G to the X modulo some prime P. B is sending G to the Y modulo some prime P. Both of them can then compute G to the XY and use that as a basis for deriving fresh keys. Okay? This is how you establish keys in a symmetric way on the web. And there, the core construction is Diffie-Hellman, G to the XY mod P. So we have to ask, well, what is this? What is G? G is some fixed known value usually. Usually it's a number 2. Okay? And P is a large prime. And typically, if you're using real modular Diffie-Hellman, it has to be at least 2000 bits is what we say now. If you're using elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, P is usually 255 bits, but the security comes from something else, not from the length of P. And the assumption that we're making, the reason why the core construction is secure, is because an attacker who does not know X or Y cannot compute G to the XY mod P. Okay, so it's like the Diffie-Hellman assumption. You can break it down in different ways, and many different ways of formalizing this. This is just an informal way of writing it down. But is that really true? Well, it's only true if the P is large enough. And this is also true for the RSA example that Xavier was showing you earlier. The P and Q have to be large, otherwise it's not secure. Right? So if the P is too small, the attacker can basically compute the discrete log. So if the attacker knows G to the Y, he can compute Y. And then, of course, he can break the protocol completely. So when we look at the strength of a cryptographic mechanism, you have to see what the latest cryptanalysis results for it are. So in this case, you can look at the records, and luckily a lot of the records are from France, so you might know the people who have these records. So the latest record is 2019. A 795-bit prime was factorized using in Leroy, I think. So So up to there, we know it's broken, right? 795-bit primes can be, you can do, not factorize, sorry, you can do the discrete log for up to 795-bit primes, okay? So clearly that's too weak, okay? But what is, if you go look in the web, what are the kinds of primes people are using? Okay, what is the size of primes? So this is a bit dated from 2015. I couldn't find a more recent large-scale study. But I would expect the numbers to be a little bit better now, but not so much. So what we found in 2015 was that people were using a large number of Diffie-Hellman groups. Most of them were 1,000-bit groups. So 1,000 is shockingly close to 795. I would imagine that the NSA can actually factor 1,024-bit primes. 2.6% were actually using 768-bit primes, which is definitely completely broken. And some number were using 512-bit primes, which were broken already like 10 years ago. So there is this notion that there is weak groups and strong groups, okay? And the more number of bits you add to it, you get stronger. So for Diffie-Hellman, for RSAs and stuff, at least the nice thing is kind of it's continuous. You can just sort of double the number of bits, and you kind of push yourself into the more secure zone. One might also ask, well, why are we using these weak groups at all? Shouldn't we just eliminate them? Why aren't we even talking about them? Well, the reason is that, in fact, it's not just weak groups. It's also a whole bunch of algorithms which are weak now, but were not weak 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Because it's not that they fundamentally changed. It's that computers got stronger, attacks got better. So what you're thinking of as the most secure thing today may be considered weak 10 years from now. And you can't just say, oh, we should just disable them all, because many of the Wi-Fi networks we have here, the printers that you have installed in your office, they don't really have the ability to update frequently enough. So there is always going to be a long tail, as I say, of slow updaters that you have to deal with. Otherwise, you won't be able to connect to your printer, which would make you very annoyed. So what you need for practical deployments is backwards compatibility. It's a very annoying notion. Scientists should never have to worry about this, but because the need for backward compatibility, you still need to support old stuff while you're developing your new stuff. A nicer way to present this constraint that we are living with is called cryptographic agility, where you say, you know what, today I have this cool new post-quantum algorithm. It's too slow to use on the entire web, but I want to already introduce it into the ecosystem so more and more people start adopting it, so that by the time the quantum computer is here, we have a good amount of experience with this and you can switch. Right? But in order to do that, we have to introduce new algorithms alongside old algorithms, where we know the old algorithms are going to get weaker. But at that point, we'll be able to gracefully switch from the old to the new. So in order to see these kinds of issues that we are seeing here, you really need to worry about systems that have both strong crypto and weak crypto, whether the weak crypto is already broken or will be broken when the quantum computer gets here, for example. So how do we deal with it? How do we protect protocols against this? Well, first of all, you shouldn't ignore the fact that there is weak crypto out there, because whatever you're using today will be weak later. So what you want to do is prove the security of protocols, right? But when you're doing that, we shouldn't always just take the most strongest assumptions on the crypto that we have, because that's almost certainly false today or will be false soon. So can you prove the security of protocols against a variety of assumptions and try to discover the weakest assumption under which it's secure? For example, you may have like a collision-friendly hash function like MD5, but maybe the way you use it in your protocol, it doesn't matter whether it has collisions at all. Okay? Maybe it's safe to use it in that way, in which case you don't have to worry about it at least. You have proved that it's secure even if your hash function has collisions. And then there is this question about whether you need an in-CPA encryption or in-CCA encryption. These kinds of things come up all the time. The second argument I would make is that you can't just ignore weak crypto. You have to consider systems that have both strong crypto and weak crypto, so that you can at least then say, okay, if you're using strong crypto, then you get good theorems. If you're using weak crypto, you don't. But both of them are there in the system. And in particular, you want to show that the presence of weak crypto, even if you don't use it, cannot affect a session that is using strong crypto. The third kind of question is, well, how do you analyze this kind of systems? Now we have said you have to analyze systems with strong crypto, with weak crypto, put them all together. Well, at this point, the complexity starts getting big already. Okay? You need to have some mechanized tools to analyze these kinds of things. All right, so that was crypto weaknesses. Let's move on to the question of, well, what happens when protocol design has flaws in it? So a protocol itself, I like to see it through the lens of composition. So what is a protocol after all? It's taking a bunch of crypto algorithms and composing them in order to achieve some target security goals. So in this TLS thing, it's using a signature, it's using KDF, it's using authenticated encryption, it's using Diffie-Hellman, putting them together in some way to achieve the goals that it has. Each of these algorithms may individually be completely strong, but the way you combine them to achieve your goal may have some flaws in it. And that's typically where all the flaws are, the way you're combining them or composing them. This gets even more kind of emphasized when you explicitly design your protocol in terms of sub-protocols that you're going to compose. So already we've seen some example where we had the authenticated key exchange sub-protocol, the authenticated encryption sub-protocol, and we were putting them together as a sequence. So it was a sequential composition. Some people call this vertical composition because one of them is generating a key and the other one is using the key. A different kind of composition, again, we've seen already, is when you have both strong and weak crypto, or let's be more balanced about this. You have two different crypto algorithms, one which the Americans like, one which the Europeans like, let's say, and they're both in the same system. Okay, so you have support for multiple algorithms. The protocol remains the same, but you're able to switch one algorithm for another in different places. So that is also kind of a composition that we have to think about. And the third one is when your protocol itself has many different modes, and you're allowing the user to pick what mode they want. So one session may use one mode, a different session may use a different mode, and you want to make sure that they cannot interfere with each other. And this is particularly hard for crypto protocols and security mechanisms in general because they don't compose very well. If you have one protocol which is perfectly secure on its own, another which is perfectly secure on its own, when you put them together, often the result is not secure, especially if they share keys or authentication credentials of any kind. So let's take an example which is inspired by a strong, weak crypto thing that we already looked at. This is just one example. There are many such problems. So suppose your client and server both support a very strong Diffie-Hellman group with 2,000 bits. But just because the client may want to connect to a printer once in a while, which is kind of old, it also supports 512-bit Diffie-Hellman. It's not really meant for the web, it's meant for connecting to this printer. Similarly, Bob, the server, also supports weak 512-bit groups because sometimes an old Microsoft Windows machine connects to it and it needs to support this old Diffie-Hellman group. But mostly it wants to use a strong 2000-bit Diffie-Hellman group that everybody should be supporting. So the way this works is that the first thing that the client is going to do is to offer to the server, listen, I'm supporting these two groups. Which one would you like to use? And the server says, obviously, I'd like to use the strong one. So both of them support the strong one. So they will agree on the strong Diffie-Hellman group and continue the entire protocol. And that's how negotiation is supposed to work. Okay, so it's called group negotiation. The problem is that the attacker will not play along. So suppose there was an attacker on the network between the two of them. What the attacker is going to do is when the client offers these two Diffie-Hellman groups, the attacker deletes the strong group from the message and only offers a weak group to the server. The server thinks, oh, this is that old Windows 95 machine again that only supports weak groups. All right, I'll use the weak group. So the server sends back a message saying, okay, let's use the weak group. The client says, oh, this is that old printer again that I have to use, which uses only weak groups. And it says, okay, let's do the weak group. So both of them actually supported the strong group, but the attacker in the middle has managed to fool both of them into thinking they're talking to somebody else who only supports weak groups. So they both will use the weak 512-bit group. And since we know that we can factor or we can do the discrete log on 512-bit primes, the attacker is going to be able to compute the key in the middle. Okay? And then he can completely take over the session. And this does not, even if you did authentication, all kinds of things, this kind of attack still appears. There are many different variants of this attack. Let's step back and kind of consider what went wrong here. And this is a particular instance of an attack called Logjam, which was published in 2015. We had a cryptographic weakness, which is that we were supporting weak Diffie-Hellman groups. We knew this, but we were also supporting strong Diffie-Hellman groups, and that's what we wanted to use. So in combination with that weakness, we required a protocol design flaw, which is the protocol itself allowed a downgrade, is what we call it, from strong groups to weak groups. So the protocol allowed downgrade, and once you have done the downgrade, then you can exploit the cryptographic weakness. And this is not an isolated example. Many of the attacks in the list that I showed you are like this. You first downgrade from strong to weak, and then you attack the weak. Again, interestingly, this only appears if you're trying to analyze a protocol that has two modes and you put both of the modes in the same system and then you see what can go wrong. If you analyze them individually, then for the weak one you would not prove anything. For the strong one you would prove everything and you would say, I'm done. But in fact, only when you put them together will you actually see this kind of attack. All right, so crypto weaknesses, protocol design flaws. The third category, unfortunately the largest category of bugs, is actually in the implementation, right? So what kind of things go wrong? We've already seen a bunch of these things in previous lectures. So when the first category is, well, for example, like Xavier was showing you some side channel attacks on cryptographic implementations before. But generally your crypto library, there's a ton of code in there. OpenSSL has 100,000 lines of crypto code. Nothing to do with SSL, this is just crypto algorithms. So of course there could be bugs in there, and there are bugs in there. Every year there's many CVEs. Some of them are functional correctness bugs, some of them are memory safety bugs, some of them are side channel bugs like timing bugs. And there's many of the attacks on TLS are actually crypto bugs. But let's go above the crypto layer. When you're parsing protocol messages, there might be bugs in that code. And there could be memory safety bugs like heartbleed, which happens when you're parsing the heartbeat message. Or they could be like, okay, you've parsed the message, but then you have an error, so you have to propagate the error, but you mess up how you propagate the error. And this is a famous Apple bug called go-to-fail. You can search for it. Or in fact, the parsing itself may give you an incorrect result. And normally, if your network message is parsed incorrectly, it will be caught later on by some crypto mechanism. But if the thing you're parsing itself is security sensitive, like an X509 certificate, the incorrect parsing may allow you to completely bypass all the security. And there's many bugs on X509 parsing that you can look up. The third category, which is what I'll look at next, is bugs in the protocol implementation. Because each protocol, because it's exchanging messages, effectively the client and the server are going to be executing some kind of state machine because there are many messages to be sent and received. And if you code that incorrectly, obviously you're going to have problems. So let's see what kinds of issues come up in TLS when you're doing state machines. So TLS itself has many possible modes. Okay, it has many versions, many key exchange algorithms, many things. And some of these have a different protocol flow from each other. For example, if you're doing the RSA key exchange, which we haven't seen before, the details don't really matter. Essentially what's happening is there's a sequence of messages that are being sent and received. So the client is going to send the client hello, then it's going to wait for this message, then it's going to wait for that message, and wait for that message, then going to send this message, send this message, send this message, wait for that message, and then start exchanging application data. So this is a sequence of sends and receives, kind of like a state machine that the client and the server implements the dual state machine, they have to go in lockstep. If you look at the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, which we have looked at before, the sequence of messages is this one. There's one difference, that in the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, there's this one extra message that the server sends to the client. And really, from these two pictures, that's all you need to care about. There's one extra state because there's one extra message that the server sends to the client. So of course, when you're implementing TLS, you want to do RSA for people who want to do RSA. You want to do Diffie-Hellman for servers that support Diffie-Hellman. You want to do both of them. You don't just want to pick one. So all your browsers will do this, and they will do the one in the previous slide as well. So now you have to compose these two state machines. Okay? Individually, I can prove that a protocol that satisfies one of those state machines, an implementation, it's correct, it's secure, as long as the protocol is secure. But how do I do them both? Well, for most of us, it's trivial. You take that. If you take these two state machines, you can say, you know what you want to do? After this message, there is a branch. If you're using RSA key exchange, you go directly there. If you're using Diffie-Hellman key exchange, you go there. Okay? It's a simple conditional branch that you're going to do in the state machine based on which mode you're running. And this mode what you're running is actually already known because it's there. It's decided in the first two messages. So it's nothing non-deterministic here. It's a very deterministic branch. Okay? So this is, in a way, pretty trivial. Okay? And if you start looking at other modes that are supported by your web browser, there's many other modes. And so the actual state machine in a web browser is a bit more like this, where there are more branches. Okay? But it's still not a terribly large state machine. Of course, if you consider all the modes supported by TLS, it gets huge. Okay? But this is only supported by OpenSSL. Nobody else really does it. Most browsers do the state machine on the right over here. Or at least they should. That's what they're they're supposed to do. So you can ask, do TLS implementations actually obey that state machine or not? Okay. So each of you is using like either an iPhone, in which case you're using one implementation of TLS, or Firefox is a different implementation, Chrome is a different implementation, the server uses a different implementation. So there are many popular implementations, not too many, let's say about 8 implementations that cover all the devices that we ever use. And we can go and check, are they actually obeying the state machine? For which what we did was to basically generate a bunch of traces, good traces and bad traces, and try to see whether it was accept all the good traces and reject all the bad traces. It's kind of a fuzzing approach towards state machines. And what you find is that in fact almost all of them do not satisfy the state machine. In fact, they either allow too many edges or always allow too many edges. As in, the red edges here are the extra edges allowed by the OpenSSL client. The green edges are the ones allowed by the OpenSSL server. And these edges should not be allowed in the state machine, but they are. You might ask, well, why are all of these implementations allowing these extra edges? Okay? And the reason is that the way they're doing the composition is not correct. Okay? So what they're doing is, instead of just making this a conditional branch, they're making this an unconditional branch. They're saying, after the server certificate, you can either give me a server hello done, or you can give me a server key exchange, and I'll try to deal with it no matter what you give to me. And this is again a bit weird. Why would you not do a conditional branch there? Well, because it obeys this famous principle of the internet called Postel's principle. At least this is my guess as to why these are all designed that way. Because Postel's principle, for those of you who don't remember this because you're too young, is be conservative in what you send, but be liberal in what you accept. Because for interoperability on the internet, you always have to be accepting of the fact that the other person might be doing something weird. So you try to accept as much weirdness as you can, while you yourself try to obey the rules as much as you can. But if you do this, you're in kind of a fuzzy world, because you might be getting tampered messages. So it's actually bad for security. So think about the client here. If you use this state machine, after the server certificate, the client doesn't know whether it's going to get this message or this message. It has to handle both. So it's possible that the server does not send it a server key exchange when it should, and it's possible that the server will send a server key exchange when it shouldn't. And both of these possibilities actually lead to very important attacks. Of course, the client should reject these cases, but maybe it will follow Postel's principle and still try to accept them, and that's going to be pretty bad. So here's how bad it can get. This is Java TLS client, so JSSC. Anybody who used Java to connect to a server for 10 years until 2015 was using this method. So if they try to connect to, say, PayPal, so you have a website which is trying to connect to PayPal to do some payment processing, the attacker can intercept the first message and pretend to be PayPal. So instead of, so when it receives the first message, it sends the server certificate, but it knows PayPal certificate, so it sends PayPal certificate. Okay? So then, after that, it's supposed to send the server key exchange message, which contains a certificate signed by PayPal. So sorry, it contains a message signed by PayPal. It cannot do this because it doesn't know PayPal's private key. But it can skip this message, because in the state machine, it's possible to follow a path which actually skips that message. It shouldn't be, but it can. But then you skip the next message too, and now if you have skipped this next message, the client is going to be waiting to send a message. The client is not going to send any of these messages. The next message the server is supposed to send is this guy, which would turn on encryption, which we don't want to do. So we skip that message too. Then we are supposed to send this message, otherwise the connection will just hang. Unless we send this message, the connection will keep hanging. So what do we do here? This message requires us to do a MAC with a key on this entire transcript over here. But we have skipped all the messages that establish the key. There is no key. So what can we do? How can we send this message when there is no key? Well, this is Java, so the key has been already initialized to zeros. So let's just use the key full of zeros and send that message. And of course, the client will accept this. And then the client will start sending application data thinking we are PayPal. And the keys that it's using is zeros. In fact, the encryption has been disabled here. The message is going in plain text. So then if the client asks the Java TLS, client saying, hey, can you tell me some details about the connection I have with PayPal right now? It will say, you have a 2048-bit RSA connection with PayPal that has verified its certificate. It's the latest, greatest certificate. I'm using AES GCM, the latest, greatest algorithm. All the details you will get from the connection are as if you're doing the absolute best crypto connection to PayPal. But of course, underneath it, because there was a bug in the state machine, we skipped the entire protocol and went to zeros. Okay? So this is a particularly egregious bug which existed in TLS, in Java, which meant that for 10 years you shouldn't have, I mean, there was no point in doing TLS in Java if that was your point, which is to protect against the network attackers. But this is not the only one. There's many other state machine attacks that have been discovered. A particularly interesting one, if you want to look at it, which I don't have time for today, is called Freak, because it combines a crypto weakness, a protocol flow, and an implementation state machine bug. And you need all three of them to come together in a perfect storm. And then this actually affected like a huge percentage of the internet. About 25% of servers were affected by this attack called Freak. Okay, so now recap. What goes wrong with TLS deployments? What is going between the theoretical TLS, which looks so nice and beautiful, to the deployed TLS? Well, these kinds of things. And it's not just TLS. In any real-world cryptographic protocol, you have to worry about these kinds of things. So what we are going to propose, what we advocate in my team, is, well, what we need to do is obviously make sure that the protocol is secure, but let's try to do this at the lowest level possible and the most comprehensive way possible, which is, let's try to implement the full TLS protocol stack in a proof-oriented programming language or security-oriented programming language and formally verify the correctness and security of the implementation itself. The whole point is, if you're dealing with the implementation and proving security for the implementation, clearly it must include all the compositions that you need for that implementation. So you're getting guarantees at the level of the deployment, not at the level of the theoretical model which might miss attacks. So we are making sure that we are not missing any of this legacy crypto attack, downgrade attack, or implementation flaws. You want to capture them all. So in particular, we want to make sure that our crypto is verified, our parsing code is verified, and the protocol code is verified in terms of security. So this is going to be the second part of the talk where I show you how to do this using this system called F star, or how we do this in brief. So F star is a security-oriented language and verification framework. It's also sometimes called a proof-oriented programming language, because the idea is that you're going to be writing code in a functional programming language that kind of looks like OCaml. But at the same time, you're going to be using dependent types in a way that kind of looks like Coq. There's also an effect system that kind of looks like monads in Haskell. And you're going to do proofs while you're writing your programs, and the proofs are going to be automated using an SMT solver, which is called Z3 in this case. And once you have done the proofs for your programs, you can then compile them out to actually executable code in OCaml, in C, and even in WebAssembly. So this is the website for the language. You can go take a look at it, download it, and so on. The key for us, from the viewpoint of crypto protocols, the key feature we will use of F star is something called refinement types, which many of you are probably familiar with, but I'll just explain it again. A refinement type is a type of the form x:(t) parentheses c, where c is a logical formula, where c can say stuff about what x is. So it's a kind of a way of defining subsets of types. But instead of just thinking of it in terms of c is saying whether x is even or not, think c could also be a predicate which expresses something about the global state. Okay? So it could be something which is not computable, which allows us to state or say a lot of things about security properties, security goals, security assumptions, and so on. Let's look at some examples which are kind of simpler. So the classic refinement type is NAT. NAT is written as n of type integer, where n is greater than or equal to 0. So that's the syntax for writing a refinement type. And this is a classical refinement type in the sense that it's basically fully self-contained. It's actually checkable. You can actually check for the n is greater than or equal to 0 and then decide it. Here is a refinement type with written inside a function. So it's actually a dependent function type, where the refinement type here is basically becoming a precondition to the function, where we are saying we can check, this function checks for the equality of two byte arrays. One is called b, one is called b prime, when the length of the two b and b prime should be the same, and returns to you a bool. So this is a precondition. You can also use refinement types to, and pre and post conditions, dependent function types, which include refinements in them to specify functional correctness for cryptographic primitives. So here, for example, suppose you have like a constant time implementation of AES, and you want to prove that it is in fact matching the functional description of AES using the S box or something like that, like a table. Then what you would do here is define, this is a spec for the AES, this is not the code for it. So you're saying I'm defining a module called AES, I have a type key, and I have abstract types in this language like an OCaml, and here the abstraction can also be used to hide the information of the key from the user, so the user cannot actually look into the key type. I have a type called block, which is a refinement type. It says bytes of length 16. There should be a little L, not a big L, sorry about that. A function encrypt, which takes a key, a block, and produces a cipher block. And here the refinement on the output, which is the post condition of this function, says that C must be the result of computing AES on K and P, where this function can be defined logically using a table, using a circuit, using whatever is your best way of specifying AES. And the decrypt function basically is the inverse of it. It can fail, and what we say is that if the input block was in fact a validly encrypted AES block, then the output block will be the corresponding plain text inside it, okay, as long as the key is matched. So I made a mistake. There's no for all K here. Oh, the K should be removed. Sorry, bug. I will remove it from the slides. Okay, and of course, I've only shown you what the types are and what we can put in the types. But the whole point is that there is, what your type safety for this type system gives you is that in all executions of the code, at any point, if you have a variable of a certain, which is supposed to satisfy a certain logical formula, in fact, in all executions at that point, it will satisfy that logical formula. So all invariants, pre and post conditions written using these refinements will be satisfied in all runs. Okay? And we'll see how this can be used to kind of set up and validate a bunch of correctness and security goals. Of course, like all other type systems that we are looking at, this is also modular in the sense that you can verify one function at a time, so it's much more scalable than many other kinds of security analysis. So what happens when you run F-star on things? Well, this is the kind of recipe for using F-star. You first write your program as an F-star module. You specify its properties as an F-star interface. Sometimes it's not as clean as that. You might interleave the spec and the code, but this is the ideal world in which you do this. Of course, your code itself can call into some trusted system libraries for which you don't have proofs, but you trust them. Or you can call into verified user libraries. And then you put all of them together and you ask F-star to verify that the module satisfies this interface. In the process of doing so, F-star will generate proof obligations and send them to an SMT solver, in this case Z3. And if Z3 is able to discharge all these proof obligations, F-star will say OK. If Z3 is not able to, or if it times out, then F-star will say, sorry, I could not prove this program to be correct. And once your verification has passed, you can then call the compiler to generate OCaml code or C code or whatever. So that's a rough recipe for what you're going to do. So this particular methodology has already been used for doing a bunch of interesting projects. So we talked about crypto libraries, and we talked about parsing. So there's a library called everparse, which we've seen lectures about in Paris in the past, but these are verified zero-copy parsers written in C, which are actually written in F-star and compiled to C. These are very efficient because they're zero-copy, but they don't have any memory safety bugs, unlike, say, they don't have any heartbleed. At the same time, the code has proofs of correctness built into it, so you get proofs of correctness for free. It has been applied to many parts of the TLS ecosystem. The second project, which I won't talk about in more detail, but it's called Hacklestar, where you have an entire crypto library which is verified, and it's then compiled to C and WebAssembly. And it has almost all the modern algorithms that you might care for. They're all in there. And they've all been verified for memory safety, functional correctness, as well as the kind of constant time coding discipline that Xavier was showing us today, where all the code is verified against this for secret independence is what we like to call it, which means that you can never branch on a secret, you can never compare two secrets, You can never use a secret as an index into an array. So this is the strict discipline that we saw in the previous lecture. And both of these and many of the code that we are concerned with here are actually written in a subset of F star called low star, which is a C-like subset of F star, which can, because then if you verify code in the subset, you can actually compile it down to C and to WebAssembly and other languages like that. Wrong direction. So just to give you a feel for what the verification conditions for this kind of code is like, I'm just going to show you one function in low star, and that's the specification of one function in low star. So we can get a sense for what are the kinds of pre and post conditions, what the proofs are, how does F star allow us to state properties about that we want to prove. So in this code, we define block P as basically a pointer or an array of bytes. So we're saying it's a buffer. Buffer is our terminology for arrays, mutable arrays, a buffer of uint 8s whose length is 16. So this is actually a mutable array, not an immutable array like bytes, and it contains uint 8s. And this uint 8 type in the way it's used in Haskell star is actually what we call a secret integer. So a secret integer has this discipline that you can only do the kinds of constant time operations that Xavier showed us in the previous lecture. You can do addition, multiplication, but you cannot do division or modulo on this. You can also not test it. You cannot extract any bits out of it. You cannot even do any comparisons with this. So it's a bit stricter than what we saw in Xavier's lecture. We can't even do a comparison, not just branch, but you can't even do a comparison on this. Similarly, you cannot convert it into an index. So you cannot use it as an index into an array. So that basically, that type there is enforcing the secret independence of constant time coding discipline in our code. You cannot do many operations on this kind of integer. So then we have this encrypt function. The type for the encrypt function, think of this as AES encryption, yeah, is that it's going to take a key, which is again going to be a pointer to a key, a type something like this. It's going to take a plain text block, and it's going to do in-place encryption of this P. So it's going to replace P with the contents of P with the ciphertext. So here the post condition, the result type of this actually has an effect. So it says it's this code is in the stack effect, which means it's only allowed to allocate and deallocate things from the stack. It is not allowed to touch any other part of the heap. It can read this key and the K and P from the heap, but it's not allowed to allocate anything on the heap. It's only going to do allocations locally on the stack. The precondition here, which is written as the requires clause, says that in the initial heap, it had better be the case that K and P are both live pointers, which means that they have been allocated, they have the appropriate types, and they have not yet been deallocated. And we require that they be disjoint, okay, as in they completely disjoint. They cannot have any intersection between them. Then we can ensure, and the post condition says, that suppose the initial heap was H0 and the final heap was H1, the result is represented by the underscore here because it's just a unit. If it was not unit, you would actually have a variable for the result as well. We said the post condition is that this function only modifies the pointer P, or the contents of the pointer P, between H0 and H1. And in fact, the final content in H1 inside P is equal to the AES function, the pure AES function applied to the content of K in H0 and the content of P in H0. Okay? So this last bit here is functional correctness. The modifies clause and the live and disjoint clauses are used to enforce memory safety. And the uint 8 thing there is basically enforcing secret independence. So they're all kind of represented here in one way or the other, and we can actually show that they actually satisfy all these properties that we care about. Okay, so that's the only bit of low stars I'm going to show you. So how do we get now to full verified protocol stacks, protocol implementation, so whole implementation of TLS? That was our ambition, right? I already said, well, we know how to do protocol components like everparse and Haskell star. But what about the protocol code itself? So that's what we're going to look at next. So this example called MeTLS, which is a cryptographically verified implementation of TLS. What's interesting about MeTLS is that, of course, it covers the entire protocol, but also that it's based on very precise cryptographic assumptions about each crypto primitive, because then it allows us to really account for weakness in crypto and strongness in crypto and reason about it. But the converse is that the proofs in MeTLS require a combination of manual crypto proofs and the larger chunk of F-star proofs. So it's a kind of a hybrid proof methodology. If I have time at the end, I'll have a couple of slides on DY star, which is a new methodology that we are working on recently, which is about symbolic protocol verification, also in F-star. But let's focus on MeTLS for now. Actually, I'm not entirely sure where I am with time. Okay.
You have 15 minutes left.
Okay. All right. So MeTLS is basically a verified reference implementation of TLS, which covers 1.0 to 1.2. You can go download it and stuff. And if you go look at it, it's basically written in a very modular style. There are 45 different modules that comprise MeTLS. So we really try to extract out every single cryptographic security functionality into its own module with its own interface. Okay? And with the numbered modules here are really the crypto modules. Everything else is functional protocol code, which is around the crypto modules. And the main security theorem we're trying to prove here is that is in two steps. The first thing is that this is the implementation of MeTLS, which is using a crypto provider, and then we're going to use some applications on type. What you're going to prove is that the MeTLS implementation is indistinguishable from an ideal implementation of the protocol, where all of the cryptography has been idealized. Okay? And this takes a good chunk of steps to do this idealization, which is why all those numbers were. We idealize them module by module by module to kind of replace each module by its idealization and show that this idealization is not losing any or not creating any additional whatever. It's indistinguishable from the initial value. And once you have done that, then we have to prove that this ideal implementation actually meets the security goals, which is a secure channel spec. Okay, so that's the kind of steps that we're going to do. Just to show what this idealization step looks like, let's look at one particular crypto primitive. Okay? So this is basically the module called MAC, which is message authentication codes. If you look at the pure functionality of MACs, this is what it is. There is a text, which is going to be input, which is going to be bytes. There's a key, and there's a MAC value you're going to produce. So there are three functions you have to implement. One is gen, which generates a fresh key. Now this is cheating a little bit. This is a stateful function, and this needs to be stateful, but I'm going to cheat and just assume it can be written like this. There's a MAC function, which is going to take a key and a text and produce a MAC, and a verify function, which takes a key, a text, and a MAC and verifies whether the MAC is valid or not. Okay? This is the simplest way of writing the functionality of MACs. Okay, but the first things we can do is to make the key abstract so that the users of the MAC function are not really going to be able to inspect the key, tamper with it, take out bits of it and leak it in some way. Okay, so let's just make that key abstract. The second thing we're going to do is make the length of the MAC fixed, because the output of MAC is actually fixed. So we know that the length of the MAC is going to be something called MAC size. And then we're going to add the authentication assumption on MACs. And the authentication assumption on MACs is that if I were to compute a MAC with a private key and you were to verify it, then you know that only somebody who knows the private key could have generated the MAC. Somebody who doesn't know the private key should not seek the key of the MAC, should not have been able to generate it. So to represent this, we use these predicates, which in F star are just types actually, but okay, let's just call it a predicate, message over key and text. And we say that whenever you call the MAC function, you must satisfy the precondition message KT. If you do that, then whenever I verify the MAC, if the result is true, then I get the fact that message KT must have been true at the point at which the MAC was created. And this predicate message can be defined in an arbitrary way by the application. So it's in fact a parameter to the MAC module. So the application may decide that I'm only going to MAC messages of the form 1, 2, and 3. So it puts them in the predicate, that the predicate says, I'm only going to MAC a message after I've reached stage 5 in the protocol, and the message is going to look like this. Then when the other person were to verify the MAC, they would know that, oh, my peer has reached stage 5 in the protocol, and he and I agree on the transcript so far. Okay? So this mechanism here, even if you don't fully understand the mechanism, how it works, is actually a very powerful way of doing authentication guarantees. But in fact, it's not actually true, because what this is basically saying is that MACs are injective. Okay? It's only in that case that I actually state that post condition. But in fact, MACs can't be injected because the output of MAC is fixed and the input of MAC is not fixed, right? So it's definitely not injective. So if I think of this as in a possibilistic sense, this is certainly an unsound API interface. I will never be able to satisfy this. In fact, the way I implement it is by calling some concrete cryptography. I'll never be able to prove that it matches that. So this is really an assumption I'm making that the MACs behave this way. But this assumption is not very easy to justify without further formalization. So the reason I can justify that is because there is, by actually saying that the exact assumption I'm making on the MAC module corresponds to the int CMA assumption that cryptographers classically make about MACs, which means the MAC is resistant to chosen message existential forgery attacks. And you can actually formalize that assumption in F star. The details are not terribly important, but this is a F star formalization of the assumption, which is called int CMA. And I can say, and we can say that the assumption here is that this particular event, forgery, is only reachable with a very small probability in the security parameter. So it's highly unlikely that this branch is ever reachable. Okay, so by writing this in F star and saying that the probability of this event happening is very low, we have a way of stating what the cryptographic assumption on MACs is. And once you have that cryptographic assumption, you can now actually do this transformation in a sound way. So what we are doing is on the right hand side is the code that will actually run. We have TLS, which is calling concrete MACs. On the left is the idealization of it. We have the same TLS code, the exact same code, which is in fact calling into the int CMA wrapper around the MAC code, which internally is going to use an idealized notion of MACs. And here the fact that this int CMA module is indistinguishable from the concrete MAC module, that is a crypto assumption. But that's a classic crypto assumption all cryptographers make. It has to be justified by the fact that the TLS protocol will only use the int CMA module with a certain discipline. And that we have to verify, that the TLS only uses MACs in the sound way. And that we will verify by F star type checking. And once you verify that we are only using MACs according to the rules of int CMA, we can throw away this concrete code, insert this ideal code in its place, and do all our verification on the left. And on the left, we now have nice assumptions and abstractions about the MAC, which you can use to do the proof. So this is one step of the transformation, which you have taken the concrete MAC module and shown how to transform it in a computationally sound way, a cryptographically sound way, into an idealized MAC module. And we do this many, many, many times. So we do it for nonces, signatures, RSA, DH, CR, APR, and then once we have transformed all of those 9 modules into idealized modules, we are still left with this 45 module soup that we have to verify. But now we don't have to worry about crypto anymore. The crypto has all been eliminated, and now we have to do standard program verification on this. And finally, what do we get? We get that the whole stack that I showed you meets a high-level secure channel API, which is not terribly different from the API that OpenSSL provides for TLS. The application doesn't need to care about what TLS is doing, but it gets secrecy and authenticity for all the application data that is exchanged. The API here does account for multiple ciphers, so it's agile, including strong and weak ciphers. So it gives you different guarantees depending on the quality of ciphers you use. It accounts for different protocol modes. It implements many different modes and composes them correctly, and accounts for compromised keys. So some of the clients, some of the servers may be compromised, and it's able to say what would be the security in these cases. So overall, this proof prevents a large class of attacks. In particular, it shows that there are no state machine bugs in our code, and there's no downgrade attacks in our code. So that's MeTLS. What's remarkable about that project is that it was, at the time it was made, and perhaps is still, the first verified implementation of a real-world protocol. Just to give you a sense of the scale of it, it was about 3 years for 5 to 10 people to work on it, about 3,600 lines of code, 2,000 lines of type annotations to do the proofs. But in addition, there were 30 pages of crypto proofs as well, supported by a 3,000-line EasyCrypt proof. So it's a combination of crypto proof and F-star proofs that together make this verified implementation. It also had a significant impact on the design of TLS because it found attacks. During the proof, we found these kinds of attacks on TLS, and then it helped improve TLS to TLS 1.3. So the question after the MeTLS project was more or less culminated was, well, okay, we managed to do all of this work, which is a huge amount of work, for one protocol, which is TLS, and it was worth it because TLS was important and we had this impact. But how do you take the lessons from this project and actually make it scale up and generalize it so you can apply it to a wide number of protocols without having to do 3 years of work every time? So that's something that we are working on now, which is called dy star. I really don't have time to go into details of it, but the basic idea is that instead of doing computational crypto proofs, we do symbolic crypto proofs, which are more abstract, more opaque, and allow us to focus on the cryptographic protocol side of things rather than the cryptographic primitive side of things. The advantage is also that we can do all our proofs, including the meta proofs about the soundness of the system within F star itself, which kind of helps because now we don't have those manual proofs to deal with. And I don't have time for this, but what I will say is that the proof technique here is based on an abstract notion of cryptography, which is represented in terms of labels, much like the security labels as Xavier was showing you. So for example, if you have a key which is produced by mixing 3 different Diffie-Hellman keys in some way, which is what happens in the signal protocol used in WhatsApp, you can give this is the abstraction of what we can prove about that key, which is really the label of that key. Actually, it says it's a meet of join, which you will be familiar with if you're using label type systems. And it says also which session of the protocol this key belongs to and which session of the peer that key belongs to and so on. So you can get very fine-grained security guarantees just by using security labels in this way, which I don't have time to show you today, but I would encourage you to go look at the paper if you're interested. The advantage, of course, is that we have already been able to apply this methodology to many different protocols, not just TLS, right? And it scales quite well. So the annotation overhead overall, I would say, is lower than the MeTLS project. And of course, because as the code grows, the verification time grows linearly, it doesn't explode. And all of the proofs are mechanized. So you don't have this notion of an extra crypto proof on the side. Contrarily, we are doing proofs in the symbolic model, which is significantly simpler than doing the computational analysis in MeTLS. Okay, so I'm going to conclude. So what I tried to show you today was when you want to do top-down, end-to-end verification of protocol stacks like TLS, you want to do TLS, you want to do packet parsing, you want to do crypto, everything you want it to be verified, it's actually now feasible. And to do this, we are recommending or advocating the use of proof-oriented, security-oriented programming languages like F star, but that is not the only way of doing this. There's also projects using EasyCrypt, which do all of these parts of the stack as well, but using different tool chain, which is based on EasyCrypt. And so you can choose the framework of your choice. I showed you a little bit about how we have verified crypto and parsers and protocols using F star. This whole area is still maturing and is under active research. In fact, there are many questions that people are wrestling with right now. One of them is that, okay, you can verify something like MeTLS, but how slow is it? How fast is it? Can you make all of this code run super fast in assembly and still have it verified? How can you deal with concurrency, for example, in a nice way? And this is all under active research, and there are many groups working around this in F star and outside. On the crypto side, we have shown you how to do a classic protocol like TLS, and with dy star, we're doing other classic protocols. But protocols that use zero-knowledge proofs, multi-party computation, fully homomorphic encryption, post-quantum protocols, that's still very much an active area of research. And there are some things which currently we don't know how to do. I showed you a little bit about secret independence, which enforces the constant time discipline that Xavier was talking about earlier today. But that just kind of prevents a certain subclass of timing attacks. Like Xavier himself was saying, there are electromagnetic radiation, but there's also fault attacks. There's a whole bunch of side channel attacks which are not at all covered here. Even, in fact, the code that I showed you is not even secured against Spectre and Meltdown. So proving the absence of these kinds of attacks is certainly an open question. And finally, the big holy grail for our field, I think in general, is that we know how to verify code that we write, but we don't necessarily know how to verify code that somebody else who doesn't know anything about verification writes. And if we could ever get there, that would obviously be an amazing achievement. But we are a bit far from that. Well, I will end the talk there.